I remember the exact moment this question hit me. I was standing in a supermarket, staring at rows of refrigerated sections, stretching as far as I could see, when it suddenly felt wrong. Not the food itself, but my complete dependence on it. Every meal I ate required electricity, transportation systems, global supply chains, and then the question arrived, sharp and unsettling. What happens when all of this stops working? More importantly, how did people survive for thousands of years without any of it? That question became an obsession. I started digging into history, not the kind taught in schools, but the practical, survival-level knowledge that kept civilizations alive. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about food, independence, and human resilience. The first thing I discovered was that our ancestors weren't just preserving food as a convenience. This was life or death. A failed harvest meant starvation. A long winter without stored provisions meant entire families could disappear. There were no grocery stores to fall back on, no emergency services delivering supplies. You either knew how to make food last, or you didn't survive. I began studying the methods they used, and I realized these weren't primitive techniques. They were sophisticated systems developed over centuries, refined through countless generations of trial and error. Each method solved a specific problem, and together they formed something remarkable. A complete food security system that required nothing modern civilization takes for granted. The first technique I investigated was dehydration. At first, it seemed almost too simple. Remove water from food, and it lasts. But the deeper I went, the more I understood its genius. Water is what allows bacteria and mold to grow. Take that away, and food becomes nearly immortal. I learned that ancient Egyptian soldiers carried dried meat on campaigns that lasted months. Native American tribes created pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that could sustain a person for years if stored properly. The Incas developed charqui, the ancestor of modern jerky, which allowed them to build an empire across territories where fresh food was impossible to transport. What struck me wasn't just that it worked, but how universally it was adopted. From the Mongolian steppes to the African savannas, from Arctic communities to Mediterranean civilizations, every culture independently discovered that removing moisture was the key to preservation. I tried it myself, cutting thin strips of meat and hanging them in a dry, ventilated space. Within days, what would normally rot in hours had transformed into something that could last months, even years. Then I encountered smoking, and I realized it was more than just adding flavor. When I researched Viking preservation methods, I learned they built entire smokehouses where fish could hang for weeks, absorbing compounds from burning wood that actively prevented decay. The smoke deposited antimicrobial substances on the food's surface while simultaneously drying it. It was a double preservation method disguised as cooking. I found records of Scottish communities smoking salmon in stone huts, creating a product that could be stored through entire winters. Germanic tribes smoked wild boar and venison, ensuring meat was available even when hunting was impossible. This wasn't recreational barbecuing. This was engineered survival. The wood type mattered, the temperature mattered, the duration mattered. Get it wrong, and the food spoiled. Get it right, and you had protein that could outlast the harshest seasons. But what fascinated me most was fermentation, because it seemed to defy logic. Instead of fighting bacteria, our ancestors learned to weaponize them. They discovered that certain bacteria, when allowed to colonize food in controlled conditions, would transform it into something that not only lasted longer, but became more nutritious. I read about Korean families burying clay pots of cabbage underground, allowing specific bacterial cultures to convert it into kimchi that could feed them through winters when fresh vegetables didn't exist. I studied how Eastern European communities developed sauerkraut using the same principle, creating vitamin-rich food that prevented scurvy during months without fresh produce. The Mongolians fermented mare's milk into arag, a drink that could be stored and transported across vast distances. The brilliance hit me when I understood this. They weren't just preserving food, they were improving it. Fermented foods contained probiotics that aided digestion, vitamins that fresh food lacked, and flavors that made monotonous diets bearable. It was preservation and nutrition engineering combined. Then there was salt, one of the most valuable commodities in human history. I learned that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. That's where the word salary comes from. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was survival technology. When salt is applied to meat or fish, it draws out moisture through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria cannot survive. I discovered that ancient Mediterranean fishing communities would layer entire catches of fish between thick beds of salt, creating preserved stockpiles that could be traded across continents. Norse fishermen developed methods of salt curing cod so effectively that it became a major export, traveling from Scandinavia to Africa and the Americas. The process was exact, wrong ratio of salt to meat, and it spoiled. Correct ratio, and it lasted indefinitely. I experimented with this myself, packing pork in coarse salt, and watching as liquids slowly drained out, leaving behind dense, preserved meat that would have made our ancestors proud. The same piece of meat that would rot in my modern refrigerator within a week was now stable at room temperature for months. For those who want to go deeper into self-sufficiency, we left a guide in the first link in the description about the best medicinal plants you can grow in your backyard. But perhaps the most elegant method I discovered was honey preservation. Honey is one of nature's perfect preservatives. It contains almost no water and is highly acidic, creating an environment where virtually nothing can grow. Archaeologists have found honey in Egyptian tombs that was over 3,000 years old and still perfectly edible. I learned that ancient civilizations would submerge fruits, nuts, even meats in honey, creating sealed preservation that required no processing, no drying, no smoking. The honey itself never spoiled, and anything stored within it remained protected indefinitely. It was preservation through chemistry, understood and utilized long before anyone knew what bacteria or pH levels were. Then there was confit, a technique I initially thought was just French cooking but turned out to be ancient preservation. The method is simple but effective. Cook meat slowly in its own fat, then store it completely submerged in that solidified fat. The fat creates an airtight seal, preventing any contact with oxygen or bacteria. I found records of this technique being used across Europe, particularly in regions where refrigeration was impossible but animal fat was abundant. Farm families would slaughter animals in autumn, when temperatures dropped, and preserve the meat this way, ensuring protein availability through entire winters. The fat itself became a valuable cooking resource, while the meat inside remained perfectly preserved for months. I also investigated root cellaring, which taught me that temperature control didn't require electricity. Our ancestors understood that underground environments maintained stable, cool temperatures year-round. They dug cellars, often beneath their homes, where root vegetables, apples, cabbages, and other hardy crops could be stored for 6 months or longer. I read accounts of Appalachian families who survived harsh winters entirely on what they'd stored in underground cellars. The temperature stayed just above freezing, humidity remained constant, and darkness prevented sprouting. It was refrigeration through geology and architecture. What became clear as I studied these methods was that they weren't isolated tricks, they formed an integrated system. A family might dry some meat, smoke some fish, ferment vegetables, cure pork in salt, preserve fruits in honey, store roots in a cellar, and seal other meats in fat. Each method served different foods and different needs. Together, they created food security that didn't depend on any external system. I started to see how fragile our modern approach is. We've built a food system that collapses without constant electricity, fuel, and logistics. A disruption at any point, whether it's power grids, transportation, or supply chains, and millions of people are suddenly vulnerable. Our ancestors built resilience into their daily lives. They produced food locally, preserved it using natural methods, and maintained knowledge that made them independent. The more I learned, the more I realized this wasn't just historical trivia. These techniques are still used today in communities that prioritize self-sufficiency. Homesteaders, survivalists, and people in remote regions still dry meat, smoke fish, ferment vegetables, and store food in cellars. The knowledge never fully disappeared. We just stopped teaching it. I began understanding that the real difference between then and now isn't technology, it's dependency. We've traded knowledge for convenience, resilience for comfort. Our ancestors couldn't afford that trade. A mistake in food preservation meant death, so they mastered it. They passed that knowledge through generations because survival required it. I started looking at specific examples that proved how critical these methods were. During the age of exploration, sailors survived months at sea on hardtack, salted meat, and dried fish. The British Navy's dominance came partly from preserving citrus and sauerkraut to prevent scurvy. The Lewis and Clark expedition relied on dried meat, smoked fish, and preserved foods. No supply lines existed. Their survival depended on food that could withstand extreme conditions and months of storage. Using techniques perfected over thousands of years, these methods saved populations during wars and sieges. Medieval cities survived for months because they had stockpiled preserved foods, smoked meats, salted fish, fermented vegetables, dried grains. What fascinated me was learning the science behind why these methods worked, even though people using them didn't understand microbiology. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew salt stopped meat from rotting. They didn't understand enzymatic processes, but they knew fermentation made food last longer. They were practical scientists, conducting experiments across generations. Each preservation method solved a specific scientific problem. Dehydration removed water bacteria needed. Smoking deposited antimicrobial compounds. Fermentation introduced beneficial bacteria. Salt created osmotic pressure that dehydrated bacterial cells. These were sophisticated solutions based on observable cause and effect. If learning how people preserved food in the past opened your eyes, you'll also want to see the guide we placed in the first link in the description about medicinal plants you can grow at home. What struck me most was how these methods required no special equipment, no industrial processes, no complex supply chains. They needed understanding, patience, and respect for natural processes. Salt, smoke, sun, bacteria, fat, temperature, time. These were the tools. and they were available to anyone willing to learn. I tested many of these techniques myself. I hung meat to dry in my garage, built a small smokehouse from scrap wood, started fermenting vegetables in jars, buried a storage container in my backyard to simulate a root cellar. Some experiments failed. I lost food to mold, incorrect temperatures, and my own inexperience, but I also succeeded. I created food that lasted far beyond what any refrigerator could offer, using methods that humanity had relied on for millennia. One of my earliest successes was with jerky. I sliced beef into thin strips, seasoned it with salt, and hung it in a dry space. Within 3 days, what would normally spoil within hours was shelf-stable for months. I kept a piece for 6 months, and it remained perfectly edible. My fermentation experiments taught me patience. I packed cabbage into jars with salt and waited. Bubbles appeared, the brine clouded, the smell changed. After 3 weeks, I had sauerkraut that was preserved and delicious. The smokehouse was challenging. I built it from an old metal drum, creating vents and a separate firebox. My first attempts failed, teaching me that wood type mattered immensely. Hickory gave strong flavor. Apple wood was milder. I learned through failure, exactly how our ancestors learned. I also experimented with honey preservation. I submerged berries in raw honey and sealed the jar. Months later, they were perfectly preserved. Simple, elegant, requiring nothing beyond a jar and honey. These experiments taught me preservation isn't difficult, it just requires understanding. The methods I was learning were robust, decentralized, and required nothing that couldn't be obtained locally. The experience changed my relationship with food completely. I stopped seeing it as something that comes from stores and started seeing it as something I could secure independently. I understood that the techniques our ancestors developed weren't outdated, they were timeless. They worked before electricity, and they'll work after it. I also realized something deeper. These preservation methods represented more than food storage. They represented human ingenuity, adaptation, and independence. Every technique was a solution to a survival problem. Every method was tested across generations, refined through necessity, and proven through the simple fact that the people who used them survived long enough to pass them on. This knowledge isn't just historically interesting, it's practically essential. We live in uncertain times. Climate change, economic instability, supply chain fragility, these aren't abstract concerns. They're real vulnerabilities in our modern food system. Knowing how to preserve food without depending on refrigeration, supermarkets, or continuous supply chains isn't paranoia, it's wisdom. I started sharing what I learned with others, and the response surprised me. People were hungry for this knowledge. Not because they wanted to abandon modern life, but because they wanted options. They wanted to know that if systems failed, they could still feed their families. They wanted independence, resilience, and skills that couldn't be taken away by circumstances beyond their control. What I discovered through this journey is that the answer to my original question wasn't complicated. People preserved food for years before supermarkets existed because they had no choice. And that necessity drove them to develop methods so effective that they still work today. They understood principles we've forgotten, that nature provides preservation tools. That knowledge is the ultimate security, and that independence comes from skills, not systems. The techniques they used, dehydration, smoking, fermentation, salting, honey preservation, fat sealing, and root cellaring weren't primitive. They were sophisticated, reliable, and proven across thousands of years of human history. They turned perishable food into long-term security. They transformed uncertainty into stability. They made survival possible in conditions we can barely imagine. And here's what gives me hope. This knowledge isn't lost. It's still accessible to anyone willing to learn it. You don't need special equipment or expensive materials. You need understanding, practice, and respect for methods that have fed humanity since long before modern civilization existed. The real lesson I took from all this research isn't about food preservation specifically. It's about self-reliance. It's about recognizing that the systems we depend on are more fragile than we realize. And the knowledge that made our ancestors resilient is still available to us if we choose to reclaim it. I started thinking about how this applies beyond just food. We've outsourced essential skills to systems, becoming dependent on them functioning perfectly. We don't preserve food, grow vegetables, or navigate without technology. Each convenience has made us comfortable but less capable. Our ancestors lived differently. An 18th century farmer could preserve food, build shelter, make tools, and survive disruptions that would cripple us today. They maintained knowledge we've let slip away. Knowledge that represented true security, independent of systems. This knowledge isn't lost, just neglected. Everything our ancestors knew exists in old books, rural communities, and people relearning forgotten skills. The information waits for anyone willing to learn it. I've come to see food preservation as a gateway skill. Once you understand you can make food last using simple techniques, you start questioning other dependencies. Each skill builds on the last, creating layers of resilience and independence. I'll continue exploring these forgotten skills, testing them, and sharing what I learn, because I believe that in an increasingly uncertain world, the wisdom of the past might be exactly what we need for the future. Our ancestors survived without supermarkets, without refrigeration, without modern supply chains. They did it through knowledge, preparation, and techniques that turned food into something that could last not just days, but years. If this resonated with you, if you want to keep learning about forgotten knowledge that builds real independence, subscribe to this channel. We're just getting started, and there's so much more to uncover. The past has lessons we desperately need, and I'm committed to bringing them forward. Join me on this journey, because what we're discovering isn't just history, it's preparation for whatever comes next.